This is my presentation on my dog, Lucy. I've known many labs. I grew up with the Labrador Retrievers, and I fostered for Labrador Retriever Rescue of Florida now for 6 years. So I've seen labs of all colors, all shapes, all sizes, all demeanors, but never one like Lucy. Lucy is crazy. Lucy is a special kind of crazy. In fact, she demonstrates behaviors that I've never seen before in any other lab. When we first got Lucy, well, let me move on. So her behaviors, we couldn't really explain them. We didn't know where they were from, why she was demonstrating such behaviors. So I wanted to know why. And with my background, I started to piece together some really interesting theories. And what's my background? I'm an OT. So what's an OT? An OT is an occupational therapist. Well, great, what's an occupational therapist, right? It's okay, very few people know what an occupational therapist really is or does unless they've had it themselves. In fact, the name confuses a lot of people. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, are you going to teach me how to get a job? Or, honey, I don't need you, I'm retired. And though I'm not going to teach you a vocation per se, or an occupational therapist doesn't teach you about a vocation, we really do teach you about skills for a very important job, skills for the job of living. Occupational therapy defines occupation as any activity that we deem, or that you specifically deem meaningful. And sure, it's easy to imagine activities that we really enjoy, like going swimming or going to the beach or dancing or cooking as meaningful activities. But what about those activities that we need every day? Things like bathing and dressing and toileting. I have to tell you, it's awfully meaningful to me that I'm able to wipe my own bottom. So, occupational therapists deal with people of all ages. I've treated 97-year-olds, I've treated 97-day-olds. And the patients we see, the treatment we provide to adults is more about relearning skills after having lost them through injury or illness. But with the pediatric occupational therapists, we normally deal with children with congenital deficits. So they have never gained the skill, and it's more about procurement of the skill rather than relearning. A lot of our children then, so what we do for our children is provide a bridge for them to learn these skills that they have otherwise not been able to learn. And the majority of them aren't able to learn them because of something called sensory processing disorder. Let me talk a little bit about that. So this is Dr. Winnie Dunn. Dr. Dunn has been instrumental in the world of occupational therapy with respect to categorizing and identifying and coming up with treatments for sensory processing disorder. Sensory processing disorder, she has to deal a lot with our area of our brain that deals with the processing center, which, let me go further on here. You recall the temporal lobe, of course. The temporal lobe is the area of the brain where we process sensory information. It's where we recognize things like intonation and give meaning to objects and different sensory things in our environment. Dr. Dunn stated that in her research, she studied children with and without disabilities and found that we all ages and all disabilities and all conditions have 4 sensory processing patterns, or 4 patterns of sensory processing, how we deal with sensory in the environment. She hypothesized that there was a relationship between the nervous system and self-regulation strategies, and the interaction of the two resulted in one of these four patterns. One of the portions of her research determined that we each have our own threshold for sensory processing or sensory information in our environment. Those with a very low threshold, it's on a continuum. Those with a low threshold tend to be readily stimulated. They actively respond to sensory information in their environment. Those instead with a very high threshold often miss stimuli and require a lot of input in order to meet that threshold, and so are often unaware and kind of they tend to miss things. And no, I'm not saying that Eli Manning has sensory processing disorder by any means, but look, also, our self-regulation is on a continuum, and our self-regulation chart is on a continuum from passive to active. And so Dr. Dunn's chart here best explains it. You can see the continuum is both on the top and on the side there. Now, before I go into this, a lot of us don't know what sensory processing disorder is. However, we are very familiar with things like autism, Down syndrome, and ADHD, childhood schizophrenia. These children are children that are many of the deficits that they demonstrate are a result of the sensory processing disorders that go along with their conditions. And so to describe some of these four areas, let me first talk to you about the sensory seeking behavior. So a child with sensory seeking behavior has both an active self-regulation strategy, but a very high threshold level. So that means they derive pleasure from sensations. But because they're not able to meet their threshold, they actively seek out information in the environment. These are the children that we stereotypically see banging their head against something or self-injurious behavior in an attempt to get more sensory stimuli. Our sensory avoiders, on the other hand, they have a low threshold, so they're often overwhelmed by the information in their environment. But because they have an active self-regulation strategy, they quickly run away from it or withdraw themselves from the situation. These are the children that we see running, screaming, or distancing themselves from stimulation that seems totally inappropriate for them to do so. And then our sensory sensitive children, they have both a low threshold and a very passive self-regulation strategy. So where they are also very overwhelmed by information, they aren't able to withdraw themselves from the situation. And these are the children that we stereotypically see flapping or fidgeting or getting agitated. And then lastly, our low registration children, they have both a high threshold and a passive self-regulation strategy. These children, their threshold is so very high that they often miss things and are unaware of what's going on around them, so they don't know to seek it out. Because of their passive self-regulation strategy, they're not actively seeking and don't get some of the very important sensory experiences that you and I get as children. Which leads me to explain to you a little bit more about sensory processing disorder and its huge impact on development. A child with sensory processing disorder can be devastating. It's through their sensory experiences that we learn how to survive and thrive and protect ourselves from the world. It's through things like sensations like hunger that we learn to feed ourselves when we're hungry. It's through things like pain that we learn not to touch a hot stove. And certainly the sensation of thirst helps to prevent us from dying from dehydration. Similarly, sensory rewards help and further develop and grow, help us with development and growth further, and that when we receive the rewards from different things that we do, it further encourages the range of motion that allowed us to obtain that reward, or the different behavior that allowed us to obtain that reward. Unfortunately, the etiology behind sensory processing in the environment, and still others on teratogens that are present during the prenatal period. Because though it is unknown, the etiology is unknown, it's been very difficult to find a cure. And I believe that since we don't really know where it's coming from, how can we limit it to one species? Especially a species that is so anatomically and neurologically similar to us, the dog, right? So that brings me to Lucy. Lucy entered the foster system as an owner surrender. The people who had her from a puppy found that when she was larger and bigger and demonstrating louder behaviors, they could no longer manage her. She would run away, and they feared her behaviors around their very young children. So they surrendered her to our organization. She spent the first part of her time in a shelter, and though there's very little information about that time, they did report her extreme behaviors, and also one episode of finding her in her feces and vomit reportedly from a seizure, but they're not really sure why. She went to her first foster, who she was with very briefly, but that foster also reported her extreme behaviors, a lot of hyperactivity, so much so that she couldn't keep any weight on her. And that's all the information I really have from her. But she couldn't manage her, so she asked that she be placed in a second foster, the second foster being a behaviorist, in the hopes that she could maybe help Lucy. The second foster took her to the University of Florida, where she was diagnosed with anxiety disorder and put on 3 different medications for her anxiety. She was put on fluoxetine, clonidine, and a nutraceutical. This second foster was very diligent, and I mean very diligent about monitoring her behaviors and documenting each and every extreme behavior that she had, as well as her very high respiratory rates and her very high heart rates. But still, it got to a point with her where she couldn't manage Lucy's behaviors, and she felt it was taking away from the care of her own dogs who were older and ill. So she asked her to be replaced as well, and that's how we got Lucy. So we said we'd take her, and I didn't know what to do with her. She was completely uncontrollable. I've always walked my dogs. I couldn't walk her. You'll see why in a little bit. I tried everything. I couldn't even soothe her as her mother, kind of foster mother. It was very difficult for me. She continued to have a lot of potential adopters, but they were usually scared off by the meds she was on or by the reported behaviors. One lady did take her only to return her 24 hours later. So that meant we had her for a very long time. And eventually, she started to show some signs of improvement. We had 3 other dogs at the time, and they were on a very strict routine, as were we, going to work all day and coming home doing the same things. And she started to really be able to follow a schedule, which I started to think a little bit about. Still tossing some things around, we kept going with her. We kept her on the pharmaceuticals. However, because of this improvement, we started to think that should she transition to any other home, she may regress further. So we decided to adopt her. And having adopted her, we thought, well, maybe we'll try her off her medication, because I couldn't really tell what it was doing for her. So we slowly weaned her from her 3 medications, and fortunately or unfortunately, we saw no change. So that and her strict following of this routine, or her improvement from the routine, started to really make me think about the sensory processing disordered children that I saw in practice. The fact that she wasn't responding to any the anxiety meds at all further made me think it maybe wasn't anxiety either. So let me give you a little bit of background about her, what those behaviors looked like. As I already spoke of, she very much benefited from a routine. However, she got to the point where she would add her own little pieces into the routine. And if you were to deter her from those activities or part of the routine, she would become inconsolable. I remember my husband used to come home every night from work and let her out, and she immediately would have to get in the pool. And if you tried to stop her from getting in the pool, she was absolutely inconsolable. She couldn't be distracted with food, even though she's very food driven. She also demonstrated a lot of self-stimulation behavior. It's said in children that the self-stimulation behavior helps them feel unfelt stimuli that they normally can't in the world around them. And it helps them organize themselves and the sensory input that they're receiving. So I'm just going to show you there, it's best if you see these kind of behaviors. But one I did notice was this oral fixation that she had, a very odd behavior regarding oral stimulation. And she would do it for hours if you let her. Another of her behaviors is pronouncing behavior. And I know a lot of dogs pronounce and hump legs and different things like that. But Lucy is neurotic about pronouncing behavior. She must do it every night at the same time in the exact same location without fail. Even though I don't have a video of it. And then her sensory seeking behavior is also very, very interesting. A lot of children with sensory processing disorder or autism are described as hyperactive, and really it's in a way for them to get the needed stimuli that they're not getting from the world. Lucy too, her hyperactivity was, especially at first, was uncontrollable. She would circle around the yard and circle without end in no direction. And it just seemed a very odd behavior to us. The other thing she does is leaning, and this is often described in the world of occupational therapy with our children with autism. You'll see them leaning against their mother's legs or their father's legs or against the wall in an attempt to receive some sort of sensory stimuli in a very uncomfortable situation. Lucy does this often with my husband, actually, especially when he's brushing his teeth. We're standing at the sink and she'll have to lean her head against his legs the entire time. The other thing that she does is when she's laying down, you'll never see her laying down with her head up. It's always on the floor or pressed against some other object, like you see her here with Gino. And then there's the dreaded walk. So I can't describe this and do it any justice, so I'm just going to show you the pictures. As you can see, I tried to show pig weight camera up and show that there's nothing in the distance. It's just a clear road, there's no dogs, nothing to stimulate her. Right. Non-stop.
Was that when you first got her? She still does that.
She doesn't do it anymore, but So, I didn't know how to explain it. Just that maybe the external environment was providing her too much stimuli. The thing that really sent it home for me was her response to trusted occupational therapy treatments. As I already mentioned, she benefited greatly from schedule. Our children with sensory processing disorders benefit incredibly from being on a strict schedule. It gives them a sense of control over their environment. She responded very well to singing. So on the walk, I would sing with her the entire time. And as we often see in our children with sensory processing disorder, we give them music therapy, or they wear headphones, or we play music in the background so that they're able to focus on the task at hand. So by singing, she was able to do the walk, manage herself on the walk a little bit better. And then the sensory diet is something that we often use, again, in occupational therapy. And it's simply a prescribed set of activities that help the child prepare for an event. So say, for example, going to bed, having the exact same routine about putting the pajamas on and brushing the teeth and reading a book, all while maybe listening to some soothing music or having aromatherapy. With Lucy, I wasn't very strict about it, but I always made sure that when we went on the walk, it wasn't after time that she was excited. Instead, it was right when we got up and she had been sleeping. And then during the preparations for the walk, while I was putting on her leash, I made sure to do everything very calmly and speak to her in a very soothing voice so as not to arouse her. And then finally, my favorite here, the heavy work. Heavy work, again, is another trusted occupational therapy technique we use. The stereotypical thing that you see in children is them wearing a weighted vest. I'm sure many of you have heard of that. The other way that we use it in occupational therapy is we have them play with heavier objects during regular playtime. So during house, using heavier blocks or different things like that. So I tried it with Lucy, and what we did was we harnessed Lucy to a garden cart, and she pulled Gino, who wasn't able to make the walk himself due to severe arthritis, and it worked amazingly. She didn't bark, just like you saw. She did nothing of that behavior. She was able to maybe a couple barks here and there, but she was able to focus in the entire time on the walk at hand. So am I saying that dogs get autism? No, or maybe, I don't know. But I'm certainly convinced that dogs do have sensory deficits just like our children do, and that perhaps it's an area of future research. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.